Greetings, friends and family. Welcome back. I'm yours, Shingema Vima. And today we're doing a special topic on Hispanic Heritage Month. Now, Hispanic Heritage Month is not something that maybe you may typically think of right away when you think about the African continent, right? Despite the fact that of the large presence of African descended peoples within the Hispanic communities and other things, historical moments of interaction. That's what we'll be focusing on today. So today I'm here, Hispanic Heritage Month, right? An American commemoration running from September 15 to October 15, commemorating and celebrating the people and cultures of people of Latin and Hispanic descent within the U.S. So today I'll be taking you through three stories from the African side, that are of particular interest to Africa and that dovetail with Hispanic Heritage Month. The first one, I'll be talking about the history of the one country on the African continent who has Spanish as the official language. The second story I'll be talking about is about a contested territory that is not quite a state, but is also a former Spanish colony, and it creates an awkward map thing in Africa. But also the geopolitics of its positionality is problematic now as it was 20, 30 years ago, and it's just a fascinating story, so we'll be telling that story. Then the third story I'll be talking about is, if you've ever watched the following clip and were fascinated by it, let's watch this.
Those of us who share your struggle for human rights and against apartheid have been somewhat disappointed by the models of human rights that you have held up since being released in jail. You've met and you have praised Fidel Castro as a leader of human rights and said that Cuba was one of the countries that's head and shoulders above all other countries in human rights, despite the fact that documents at the United Nations and elsewhere show that Cuba is one of the worst.
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. Of every country towards our attitude towards any country is determined by the attitude of that country to our struggle. Yasser Arafat, Colonel Gaddafi, Fidel Castro support our struggle to the hilt.
Then I'm talking about that today as well. That was Nelson Mandela talking about his camaraderie with Fidel Castro. And we're taking it back to a moment, a season, 1975 to 1988, thereabouts, in which Cuban troops were in southern Africa, particularly in Angola, but also moving in Namibia and spaces like that, and how that led to a collapse of the apartheid system. So we'll be talking about all that in this video. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you guys at the end. When we think about the colonial era in Africa, we don't often think of Spain, right? Of course, we think of France, where there's talking about Leopold Senghor. You see the French national team right now. You think of Britain, and of course, we think about their presence in South Africa, Niger, Zimbabwe, old school Rhodesia, right through to the Benin Bronzes. You think about Portugal, think about Angola, Mozambique, the Carnation Revolution, and these things. But Spain, that's a bit more of a head scratcher. Yet Equatorial Guinea, the tiny nation on the west coast of Central Africa, is officially Spanish speaking. So let's learn a little more about that. And as we do all the time, I'll be citing my sources in the description box, but also mentioning the main ones I'm using here as I speak. So this one here, I've used a retrospect journal article by Isabel Shaw, and this particular piece is, the journal is from Edinburgh University, indeed. So the Gulf of Equatorial Guinea, right, west coast of Central Africa, which includes the islands of Bioko, Annobon, and continental Rio Muni, is the only country in Africa with Spanish as a co-official language. And how do we get there? In 1778, Spain invaded Equatorial Guinea, right? This is way before the Berlin Conference, but long into the transatlantic slave trade. So the Iberian nations and other European nations have been in Africa for a while at this point. Well, the Spaniards benefited from the sale of food products created by the colonization of Equatorial Guinea, the illegal trafficking of slaves, and their inhumane treatment underlines how the Spanish monarchs intentionally exploited the indigenous population here. The colonial control of Equatorial Guinea began under the rule of Spanish elite and the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, a viceroyalty created during Spain's colonization of Central and South America. Now, in the scramble for Africa in the late 1800s, Spain showed up at the Berlin Conference, but here's the kicker. By then, they didn't have the power, money, or naval presence to grab the huge chunks that other countries like Britain and France were grabbing. So it got scraps. It held on to Equatorial Guinea, right? This one of those was, known as Fernando Po at the time. This is Bioko Island, indeed. So, and Spain ultimately didn't pour much into the colony. Unlike France or Britain, it wasn't a high priority, right? Spain had already regressed significantly in the global geopolitics of the 1800s to early 1900s. It was really Britain and France. And while Portugal also had regressed, Portugal had a bigger presence even prior to that, with a significant presence in East Africa, right? The Swahili coast, or the Swahili, Mozambique, Angola, and these things, indeed. But for Spain, it wasn't the same. But the language stuck around. Schools, bureaucracy, and the Catholic Church ran in Spanish in Equatorial Guinea. And after independence in 1968, leaders like Francis Macias Nguema and even later Teodoro Obiang Basogo kept Spanish as the official language. So the result is today, Equatorial Guinea is a linguistic outlier in Africa. Spanish is still the official language alongside French and Portuguese, which is why Ms. Shaw described that as a core official language, though on the ground, people mostly speak indigenous languages like Fang or Bubi. So there you have it. Equatorial Guinea is not only the feel-good story of the 2023 AFCON, or about our man Baltazar. If you know, you know. It is a reminder that colonial leftovers can have long, very long half-lives, indeed, as we see with the continued use of Spanish in Equatorial Guinea. That was our first story. Alright, next up we are talking about Western Sahara. Let's talk about the Western Sahara real quick. Shifting a little bit to the north. So this Western Sahara is a desert territory on the Atlantic coast, right? About the size of the UK. And who owns it? You probably haven't heard of this nation. You may have heard of the space. But as a nation, who owns it? Well, that's a little bit complicated, right? Spain, again, Hispanic Heritage Month. Spain originally grabbed the area in the late 19th century, calling it Spanish Sahara. But after decolonization, in the 1970s, Spain walked away, but instead of independence, Morocco moved in from the north and Mauritania from the south. Enter the Polisario Front, a liberation movement made up of Sahrawis, the indigenous people of Western Sahara. They declared the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic in 1976, fought guerrilla wars, and got support from Algeria. Now, Mauritania wasn't really about that life, so they quickly bowed out, signing peace in 1979. But Morocco dug in. Today, Morocco controls about 80% of Western Sahara,
including all major cities like El Aaiún, while Polisario controls scattered desert areas east of Moroccan-built sand wall, and they continue to push for independence. So as we talk more about Western Sahara, I'll be referring to an article written by Esther Son in the Council of Foreign Relations. For the Council of Foreign Relations, again, you'll find that link in the description here. It says here, Western Sahara was an overseas Spanish colony from the 1880s until the mid-1970s. Mauritania and Morocco both laid claim to the territory after Spain withdrew, partitioning it between them. But in 1975, the Polisario Front, the political and military force that proclaimed the SADR, right, remember, Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, launched a guerrilla war against both countries. After Mauritania signed a peace deal with the Polisario and withdrew in 1979, Morocco annexed the remainder of the Western Sahara, and the conflict continued. Now, the dispute over Western Sahara has been a major flashpoint in the rivalry between Morocco and neighboring Algeria, which can be traced back to a decades-old border conflict. In 1975, the Polisario Front relocated its headquarters to the town of Tindouf in Algeria, which has since provided the group with military aid and allowed it to operate out of Algerian territory. Now think about that. Bilateral tensions increased after Morocco normalized relations with Israel in exchange for the U.S.'s recognition of its claim to Western Sahara. So the U.S. and Mexico have been, and Morocco, what am I talking about, Mexico? And Morocco have been doing these deals since back when Morocco became the first nation to recognize the revolting colonies as a nation back in the 18th century, right? So that's pretty interesting. So this led to Algeria to sever diplomatic ties with Morocco in 2021. Think about that. Right? These nations are all the nations of the Middle East and the Arab world are largely in some form of concert, right, in tandem against Israel. Then Morocco is out here doing these deals behind the scenes here. Additionally, Iran has reportedly supplied arms to the Polisario Front, sparking further concerns that Western Sahara is being used as a proxy by regional powers. The Western Sahara conflict has also driven up tensions within the African Union, whose decision to grant membership to the SADR in 1984, right, led Morocco to withdraw from the bloc. Morocco rejoined the AU in 2017, and since then the bloc has largely avoided the issue, right? Sort of making it seem, as the elephant in the room, as it were. But it's very interesting because if you know Morocco's role in the very founding of the Organization of African Unity that would become the African Union later, the name would change. The more radical group was known as the Casablanca group because that's where folks were meeting, Kwame Nkrumah and other leaders who were more gung-ho towards African unity. So to imagine that Morocco would spend almost 3 decades away from that organization on account of this issue just shows how much of a sore spot it is. Western Sahara is also of major economic importance. Together, Morocco and Western Sahara are estimated to contain 70% of the world's phosphate reserves, which are crucial to fertilizer production and thus global food supply chains. One mine in Western Sahara, Bokra, produces about 10% of Morocco's total phosphate exports, and some experts say that renewed conflict could disrupt this production. So what are the prospects for resolution? And I'm still citing here from the Council on Foreign Relations. Diplomatic pressures could be building for an end to the conflict. Morocco's plan would grant autonomy for Western Sahara while keeping it under Moroccan control. This idea gained international backing, including support from many Western nations such as United States, France, Spain, and support for the SADR's independence has weakened. According to experts, countries such as France and Spain are keen to maintain good relations with Morocco because they need to help on other issues, namely migration management and counter-terrorism. However, the Polisario Front hasn't moved from its demands for a referendum on independence, leaving negotiations at large. So this is something worth watching to see how this plays out. And what about passports? What do they do? Well, who are these? What are these people? What citizens are they? Well, the Sahrawis in Moroccan zones carry Moroccan passports. Those in refugee camps in Algeria might carry Polisario-issued Sahrawi passports, recognized only by a handful of countries. Many others rely on Algerian refugee documents, though. The UN considers Western Sahara a non-self-governing territory, basically. It's Africa's last unresolved colony. And here's the kicker. Every now and then, the issue flares up in global diplomacy, but otherwise, it just simmers, as we're talking about here. So they pretty much exist in limbo. So if you've ever looked at a map of Africa and seen that gap in the northwest Africa, that is Western Sahara, a formerly Spanish Sahara, a former Spanish colony, as it were, indeed. All right, and now to our last stop, Cuba in Angola, right? All right, so Angola in the mid-1970s, Portugal suddenly drops its colony. Remember, the Carnation Revolution has happened. Portugal drops its colonies, and instead of Independence Day celebration, the country plunges into civil war. Now, there are three groups in Angola that are vying for power. The MPLA, which is a Marxist-leaning group backed by the Soviets. UNITA, Savimbi and them, backed by the US and apartheid South Africa, so that's the West-leaning joint. Then the FNLA, which is also backed by the West and also by Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there are two that are backed by the West. FNLA is the older one. That's why it retained some support from the West. But the US and South Africa had felt that UNITA was a little more effective when it broke away and started to do its own thing. So they backed that horse. We mentioned apartheid South Africa. And even though we're talking about Cuba in Angola, it's very important that we also see how South Africa fits into this, right? It plays a very important role. Cuba's support for South Africa's liberation was of a different sort from that of other anti-apartheid movements. It came not in the form of civil society activism, but as a state in alliance with provisional governments and independent states in the African continent. And for this, I'm mainly using the source South African History Online. Fantastic source, one of my favorites. Cuba's military engagement in Angola kept the apartheid state in check, foiling its geopolitical strategies and forcing it to concede defeated Quito Carnavale. That's what we'll be talking about today. So let's go back to the 60s with Cuba and Africa. Already in the 60s, Che Guevara, right? Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who became a Cuban revolutionary alongside Fidel and Raul Castro and the other guys, provided support for the liberation movement in the Congo. At the first summit of the heads of state of the Non-Aligned Summit in Belgrade in 1961, right, Non-Aligned Movement, Cuban President Osvaldo Torrado denounced apartheid, right then, 1961. Attending the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva in 1961, Che Guevara, who was then the Ministry of Industry, said that South Africa violates the Charter of the United Nations by the inhuman and fascist policy of apartheid, and he called for South Africa's expulsion from the UN. Speaking again, very insistent, particularly against apartheid as sort of this last bastion of white supremacy, or in Southern Africa, or in Africa, or at the time it wasn't the last, but it was definitely the most enduring and most visible by way of being a settler colony. In 1960, Cuba began to receive students from the Republic of Guinea, Congo-Brazzaville, and Mali, and in 1963, Cuba sent a team of medics to the newly liberated Algeria. Right? And we know that Cuba does this with the medics, right? Indeed. By 1999, More than 28,000 African students had graduated from educational institutions in Cuba, and more than 76,000 Cubans had served in Africa in some capacity or other. Right. So let's bring it back to Angola in the 1970s. Remember those three groups I spoke about, the MPLA, UNITA, and the FNLA? So into this chaos, right, Fidel Castro, the Cubans, launched Operation Carlota in 1975, airlifting thousands of Cuban soldiers into Angola, not as occupiers, but as allies to the MPLA. Leaders like Agostinho Neto in Angola and Raul Castro and General Arnaldo Ochoa on the Cuban side shaped this unlikely transatlantic partnership. The Cubans held the line in Luanda, right, keeping the capital in MPLA hands against the UNITA, which was supported by the US and South Africa. Now, what it all boiled down to is the Battle of Cuito Carnavale, one of the biggest battles on African soil since World War II. Cuban and Angolan forces squared off against South African troops and UNITA. Right, so let's play this out. The Battle of Cuito Carnavale deserves its own rewind. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about that. The Soviets had advised the Angolans to launch an offensive against Savimbi, that's the UNITA, in Mavinga, and they provided modern arms to the FAPLA to crush UNITA, right? In July 1987, that's the month I was born, the very month I was born, as part of Operation Saluting October, the MPLA troops, right, FAPLA troops began to march to Mavinga. After some successes against UNITA, the South Africans launched a counter-offensive, Operation Modular, using a contingent of 9,000 troops. The village of Cuito Carnavale is situated to the west of Cuito Carnavale River, and 3 Angolan brigades were based in an arc to the east of the river, connected to the west by a bridge. 2 Angolan brigades were based in the west behind the village. With the South Africans in an increasingly threatening position, new Angolan President José Eduardo dos Santos asked the Cubans for further reinforcements. Cuba responded by sending tens of thousands of troops to help the Angolans, at the risk of Cuba being destabilized by the Americans. The Cold War proxy conflict, right? The Cuban reinforcements carrying materiel set out on 23 November 1987 and established the Southern Front General Staff, with General Leonardo Sintra Frias in command. An advance party of Cuban advisors and technical staff moved to Cuito Carnavale, which was under attack from South African and UNITA forces. On 13 January 1988 now, the South Africans launched a massive attack on the east side of Cuito Carnavale River. The next day, the Cubans decided to move a tactical group from Menongwe to Quito. The South African attack on 13 January, a rainy day, was launched with the expectation that the Angolans would be unable to use the MiG fighter planes to help the ground troops. However, the weather cleared and the MiGs were used to attack South African positions using 32 tons of bombs in 22 missions. The South Africans retreated, leaving behind 7 tanks and various other armored vehicles. On 14 January, 3 South African and 6 UNITA battalions launched another fierce attack, breaking through a gap between the 25th and the 59th Angolan brigades. The Cubans lost 14 men and 6 tanks, but the 3 Angolan brigades were able to retreat out of harm's way. So the fighting would continue. The South Africans, increasingly outmaneuvered, launched an attack on 25 January, which was repelled. Their last attacks took place weeks later on 3 days, 1, 21, and 23 March. On the first of these, they lost 20 men and 59 were injured. In the last attack, they retreated in haste after suffering heavy losses, leaving behind various military vehicles, including 3 Oliphant tanks. Still, they continued to mount attacks even as they retreated. Meanwhile, Cuban Angolan forces, together with SWAPO combatants now joining in from Namibia, began an offensive towards the Namibian border. With 40,000 Cubans, 30,000 Angolans, and 1,000 Namibians using 1,000 tanks, 1,600 anti-aircraft weapons and artillery, as well as 1,000 armored vehicles, they moved south, engaging in the first skirmish on 4 May. So the clashes would go on, and on 27 June, South African Defense Forces were again ambushed with 20 men from the 32nd Buffalo Battalion killed. The Cubans and Angolans began to turn the Kahama Strip into an operational base. Bulldozers and loading equipment were sent from Cuba, and by June the airstrip was reconstructed, 2,500 meters long and 30 meters wide, so that large aircraft could land there. By June, the Cuban Angolans were 50 kilometers from the Namibian border, and the South Africans were forced to the negotiating table. So the result wasn't a total victory per se, but it forced South Africa to renegotiate. Here's the domino effect. The battle led to the accords that saw Cuban withdrawal, South Africa's retreat, and ultimately Namibia gaining independence in 1990. So, a fight in rural Angola helped redraw the political map of Southern Africa, indeed. So, the Cubans were there from 1975 till 1991 when they finally left. And so around 16 years, right? With peak presence being in the mid-1980s when there was 50,000 Cuban troops. And I've been to some of the memorials today in South Africa. Freedom Park, one of my favorite places to visit in South Africa, pays tribute to the Cuban fighters, indeed. And when they were there, how did they get along with the Angolans? Surprisingly well, man. And like many foreign forces, the Cubans were seen as comrades in arms, anti-colonial brothers, not colonizers. Even today, Angolans often remember Cuban doctors, teachers, and soldiers fondly. Indeed. So did the Cubans win in Angola? Well, yeah. The MPLA survived, went on to rule. Angola stayed socialist leaning for a while. Namibia got its freedom. Yeah, I think they met their goals. That was a flawless victory for that side of things. And indeed, these are 3 stories I just wanted to share today that show that, sure, when we talk about Hispanic heritage, we're talking about a very specifically people of Hispanic and Latino descent within the U.S., but there are connections with other parts of the world as well to this community, and Africa is one of those places. And among the many connections that we have with Latin America and this Hispanic community as a whole, this is another one. And now you know. Catch you next time. I've been Shingi Mavima. 1.